Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks again for coming today. It's nice to see so many of you here. I am so excited to be here for many reasons. Escaping the polar vortex is one. Getting into Waymos, Barbara and I have been living our best lives in ambient mode in Waymo. And then, of course, not the least of which is having the opportunity to share this riser with my former favorite client and now good friend, Barbara Salami. I'm Lauren Milne, the Chief Strategy and Growth Officer at Applied Digital. Barbara, I'll let you introduce yourself.
And I'm Barbara Salami, as in salami and cheese. I always talk because I get salami, I'm like, no, it's salami and cheese. I am currently the CEO and co-founder of Kindly, which is an AI fluency and adoption accelerator. Prior to that, I spent over 20 years in pharmaceuticals, life sciences, and really working at the intersection of brand, technology, and commercial excellence. So really excited to be on this journey with you.
And we actually met 6 years ago, almost 6 years ago, at the very beginning of COVID, before vaccines had rolled out. And you were 5, maybe 6 weeks into your new role at Moderna. And you had been charged with taking this R&D organization and converting it into a commercial engine that would allow for the promotion, the sale, the support, and ultimately experience delivery for all those who would be using the mRNA vaccine across the entire globe. So it was, we were lucky to be partners to you in that journey, but it was an absolutely wild time.
It was.
And when we think about the topic today, the perpetual race that brands are in to win, the endless pressure that I know everyone in this room feels around moving faster and faster, working harder and harder, having less resources, of course. That's not getting any easier. But then still spending a ton of money on what we think is infrastructure that will give us the leg up, right? And what we're seeing is actually more convergence around brand experience and interaction, and less of the more meaningful differentiation and advantage for consumers, customers. So we want to dig into that a little bit and kind of lean on you for some of the insights you can share. But I think it's also an opportunity to understand what levers we can pull on now. Everybody's inundated with news about AI, and crazy stuff is happening every day. I just finished the hard fork episode on the Molt book thing. Wild. But it's coming, and it's going to do what it's going to do, and some of it's going to make us really uncomfortable. But I think we can also learn how to use it to our advantage. On the other side, just following the conversation we just listened to, we're all obviously here because we're sports fans of at least one sport or another, and that does make you feel real emotion. It makes you feel truly connected. And I think we're trying to figure out, how do you bring the two things together, right? How do you not completely lose the emotional connection that all brands want, while we figure out how to make use of this new enabling technology that is AI. So that's what we're gonna cover in the next 25 minutes. Okay, so let's get started. So as you said, you've spent the better part of your career working with some of the most competitive global pharma organizations, some of the highest, more well-recognized brands inside of GSK and Moderna, and most recently Novo Nordisk, and working very hard to make those kind of the leaders in their respective categories. So what did you find was driving real advantage for you as you did that, even as things started to look more and more the same out in market?
First of all, I'm an Eagles fan. I shouldn't say that, but I do love the 49ers. So I'm glad to be here. Just needed to say it because folks are like, what are you doing there? But I will say that when I take a look, at least my experiences and where I've been, I usually end up in roles where there's this urgency, right? So it's either we are dealing with very intense competition. My last scenario with Novo Nordisk, Ozempic, and Wegovy, it was really competitive when you think about who we were in the market against. And so speed usually is the default. Get the content out faster, get the segmentation right, figure out what data we have. And that usually, in certain cases, like during the pandemic with Moderna, that made sense. We only had 4 months to get 1 billion doses out to the world. And so it made sense. Speed made sense. But as you start really evolving from, I'll use Moderna as an example, from being a pandemic stage company to one that really had ambitions to become multi-product, a multi-product global organization, then what really mattered was less about the speed, maybe even the data precision, and more about understanding the human. And that's what I really loved about the experience I had with Lauren. We became fast friends when we met, was because we really started with who exactly needs to be impacted and what exactly is the friction. Once you understand what that is, your marketing messages resonate. Um, you stop like falling into the trap of the omni-channel story or next best action engine, and really start thinking about people not as just, I would say, sales targets, but individuals who you're really influencing, not just to get aware of your product, but hopefully buy your product and stay on your product. So for me, when I think about the journey, it's really understanding when speed is necessary, but more importantly, relevance. And for marketers, and I'll say I'm not as familiar with all the different areas, but at least in life sciences and healthcare, there's always a tendency to focus on the core differentiating messages. But beginning to think about the messaging, the emotional connection, and the experience that you need to deliver is essentially what I think is truly an opportunity. And for Moderna, as we moved to this new phase of wanting to compete in the real world, experience became the thing that we had to anchor onto.
And I think as we were talking about this day and what we were going to be talking about here, the Novo Nordisk experience was different, right? Different time, post-COVID, still investing in the same types of things, right? Trying to make that organization move faster, build the infrastructure with, all the data that was needed to be able to use that data, optimization, personalization. But you had remarked that it didn't really matter.
It didn't matter because every other competitor was doing the same thing.
Right.
I remember a meeting I had where it was obviously a competitive intelligence session, and we took a look at 4 competitors, including ourselves, and but for the messaging, if the messaging had been taken out, everything looked the same channels, the same cadence, the same mix. And I couldn't really differentiate us from our competition. And I think maybe the challenge there is it's really important to have a contrarian in the room sometimes, right? How do you think very differently about when it's important to be similar and when you really need to truly compete? And so the conversation was, well, we've delivered X billion impressions. We're leveraging these 5 different channels. In fact, we have like modular content and we're leveraging it, X number of times. And that really was the wrong metric. I would describe that as the watermelon effect, where it's beautifully green out there because we have the counts. But when you slice the watermelon, it's red because at the end of the day, we were still losing value because we had not connected with the patients. The doctors had a completely different sense of what value was given the time. And ultimately, I think everybody already knows what the news is, right? There was really a need for us to start thinking very differently about how we pivot and differentiate.
And so, speaking of pivot, you were in these organizations, in these enterprises when AI showed up, when people started experimenting with AI to varying degrees of success. Now it's starting to make its way into kind of the core aspects of the infrastructure. But are you seeing it add an advantage? Are you seeing it change the way brands are behaving? And should they start considering how to change behavior based on what you've experienced?
Lots. So first and foremost, when I think about, I'll just with The reason why I can probably talk about this is just because of my experience at Moderna. When when I joined Moderna, the very first day, the question I had was, how would we use AI to create magic and get us that 1 billion? And that was the story for 4 years. You could never walk into the CEO's office without a plan for how AI would be a core for how you created value. And that completely rewired me, quite frankly, because I was coming from GSK, big brand, but who cares about that? We'll spend billions of dollars in advertising and we'll get who we want. And as I think about why I was so excited about AI is because it started allowing us do the things that we thought we could do well, but quite frankly, we couldn't do as well as the model. It could analyze the data much faster. It could come up with ideas better than we would imagine. Um, it quite frankly could mimic the orchestration of your messages as well. Where I think the opportunity, where I, even for me as Barbara, at some point I started getting a little lazy. I stopped questioning whether or not the model was giving me the right answer because it was easier to get the work done. And that's really the damage I think AI can have when we start thinking about how marketers should think about it. It is probably the most friendly, enthusiastic co-partner, thought partner you could have. It tells you exactly what you want to hear, and it does it confidently, even if it's wrong. And so really learning, and I'll tell you how I basically got myself out of that funk, was I had to put together a white paper for the board. Um, it generated the most amazing analysis. I was so proud. And something was like, Barbara, you this Nigerian child, this job, you don't want to lose it. Go back and pay attention. And every single reference was wrong. It was literally 24 hours to get to the board. And so I I think the thing we need to do very differently as marketers is remember that AI can augment, can automate certain things, but judgment and our conviction should never be outsourced to that platform. It is not human. I know at Multibook, it feels like it's human. They created their own, I think, their own religion and government, but it still requires the insights from us. And it's our responsibility to question whether or not the answer is right. And even if it's right, if it's really in line to what the brand really represents. And so I think that's really what I would say about it is it creates the efficiency, but efficiency doesn't always translate to value. It could do it faster, but you have to think about when urgency is important and when it makes sense to take a step back and really understand deeper what your customers need. I was about to say patience because of my area. What your customers need. And more importantly, just recognize that it's almost like your coworker and intern. And it's only as good as what you pressure test, what you tell it, and what you tell it not to, what you tell it to do, as well as what you tell it not to do.
So the other thing we talked about was, we're here and we're trying to figure out how do non-sports brands create the same kind of emotional connection that we do see in sports, and how does that start to happen when it's no longer humans interacting with your different digital touch points or assets, but it's the agents? Because you had a perspective on that I was like, well, that does make me feel a little bit nervous. But what is it going to do when it's the agents operating on behalf of brands to the potential for emotional connection if they value things differently than humans do?
Yeah, so what Lauren is describing is this idea of the duality of customers that we have to deal with. Um, we know that we're humans, we're still here, and then we have these machines that are mimicking humans, right? So the agents. And when you think about the emotional connection that I get from watching an ad or from like an actual experience, it's very different from what an agent would. So, what we talked about was how do brands really design brand experiences and emotion in a world where, as humans, we feel connected to a brand and we're more likely to not initiate the engagement because of that. But we're also beginning to get into the era where individuals are outsourcing the transactional parts of the brand experience to a machine. And in those scenarios, machines don't really care about what's great. I mean, who knows? Maybe eventually, but for today, it's all about how quickly was I able to get to the outcome, the assignment I was given. Was it difficult? And if it was difficult, I am going to remember forever. If we think about what these machines can do, they have a persistent memory, and they put that and they lock that in there. And the next time there's an opportunity to engage, even if you initiate it because of your emotional connection, more likely than not, that agent is going to go around and look for the easiest way to solve the problem. So when we think now about branding and designing in this duality, you have to think about what you need to do to drive that continued emotional connection so that the experiences do get initiated by our human customers. But you also need to start thinking about designing your agents and defining really what brand loyalty means. It's easier. You don't have a lot of latency. It has data that can be leveraged. And more importantly, I shouldn't forget, it's also responsible in how it includes or excludes potential individuals and brands that it engages with.
So maybe this is a good opportunity to switch now to you've said you recently left Novo Nordisk. You have co-founded Kindly. It would be great for you to explain what is Kindly and what really was the driving factor behind starting it now. And Leanna's in the audience, just
Hey,
co-founded.
Leanna, that's my partner. It's not even a long story how we met. We met at a conference. We fell in love with each other. We found out that we're lefties. Birthdays are close. And it just happened. So I'm very grateful to be on this journey with her. So Kindly, I left a very lucrative job. I didn't want to be with Ozempic and, Wegovy. But the challenge I was having, I tend to pick roles that are very difficult, wicked problems, I would say, with the hopes that I could help change the trajectory of organizations or failing brands or building from scratch. But I always found myself in the same situation where the leaders talk very beautifully about the strategy, and I happen to be in those rooms as well. And then your tech teams do a beautiful job building stuff, but somewhere in the middle, many of us, including myself, would feel disconnected. So in the case of AI, just came from Davos. Everybody was talking about AI. Go do some magic with AI. And so your entire organization is scrambling. Marketers are trying to figure out what could I do with AI. Well, it's not really what problem am I solving. It's how can I use AI? What can AI do for me? And then you have your tech teams who typically like to build, and I happen to have been one of them at some point, build the most robot, the Lamborghini that nobody ever wants to drive, right? And in between are the individuals who actually make the strategy live or die. And the problem there isn't that they don't want it to work, it's because we haven't really thought about how to teach them to use the tools the right way. I use the analogy of AI being a vehicle. So if we used NASCAR, for instance, and we had all these cars, you only need so many mechanics, truly. But we really need, most of the marketers and most of us in the room here are drivers. We need to figure out how to steer. We might have windy roads like San Francisco. I always feel like I'm falling down and about to fall. And those, you need to have like enough judgment to know where you accelerate versus slow down. So you need to have the experience to see around the corners and ultimately be very, very clear in terms of what the outcome is, which might be get the passengers to the destination safely. AI is just the car. What happens with most organizations? Like, well, we now have ChatGPT, we have Claude, we have Grok, XAI. You have it, so now you should be proficient. And I felt like many, um, a vulnerable adopter. I was in rooms where people were talking about the technology in a way. I'm an engineer by training, but I'm not Einstein, right? And it was very difficult to understand and conceptualize how I use the technology to create value. I was frustrated. I was leading AI transformation at Novo Nordisk, and I couldn't get things to move the way I wanted. So I decided that I would leave the company and do it the right way. Help so many of us who actually are left behind. I don't think the AI adoption challenge, as we read about, is really about being less intelligent or weaker than others. It's just because it's not a skill gap, it's an access gap. And so, kindly, as a fluency and adoption accelerator, is really focused on teaching people how do you use this platform and when do you use it and when don't you use it, without forgetting that you actually have an overarching outcome to deliver. How do you start to build the right disciplines and habits around using it more often? It's going to fail, it's not perfect. And then how do you as individuals really set yourselves up with the competitive advantage you need to be of value to your organizations and collectively, hopefully help organizations like the 49ers win, win Super Bowls as well as fans, right? So essentially that's, what we're about. And so I'm really excited. Put this crazy stake. We did this together. We're like 1 million people impacted and changed by 2030. I was super nervous when we did that, but I'm really excited that and believe that we can do that and close the gap for people of color who don't feel safe to fail with these tools in environments, for those who are older who feel like, wow, this is a new technology, I can't keep up. We've met a couple, I would say, younger professionals who are afraid that AI is going to replace them. And then there are those who actually don't even fit into a corporate environment. They don't have learning and development organizations that have big budgets and feel like they can't compete in their domains. And so our job is really to meet people where they are and make sure that no one gets left behind. I'm sorry, I feel emotional about this because I'm a woman of color, I'm a Black woman. And I have felt being left out from so many things. And if there's one legacy I can have, is to make sure that everyone, irrespective of your vulnerability, does not get left behind with this technology.
I think that's amazing.
Um,
And actually, that's a nice place to finish because I know we're at time. So thank you so much. Thank you all again.
Thank you.